So one of the propositions that I set forth for you last week was that the most real things are the things that are most permanent across time and that manifest themselves in the largest number of situations. And those are the things that you have to map successfully in order to survive. Survive as individuals, but survive as a species over a very long period of time. And so the question is, one question is, what are the constants of experience? If you are a follower of the evolutionary psychologists, and to some degree the evolutionary biologists, but I would say more the psychologists like Tooby and Cosmides, they have a very Afrocentric view of human evolution. And the idea basically is that after we diverged from the common ancestor between chimpanzees, bonobos, and human beings, we spent a tremendous amount of time in the African environment, mostly on the veldt, although we're not absolutely certain about that. We're also very good in water, human beings, and we have some of the features of aquatic mammals. So, well, hairlessness being one of them. Women have a subcutaneous layer of fat. Our feet are quite nicely adapted for swimming. And so Buckminster Fuller, who I wouldn't call a mainstream evolutionary psychologist, hypothesized back in the 70s that we spent some period of time in our evolutionary history living on beaches near the ocean. And that idea really echoes for me, because we like beaches a lot, and it's a great place if you want to get easy food. And we're pretty damn good at swimming for terrestrial mammals, and we are hairless, and we do cry salt tears, and there's a lot of evidence that and our feet, if you think about our feet, they're quite flipper-like. I know we stand up and all that and walk, so that's part of the adaptation, but we're pretty good at swimming. So anyways, the classical evolutionary psychology view is that we spent most of our time on the African veldt in the critical period of our evolutionary development, let's say, after we diverged from this common ancestor, and that we're adapted for that environment. And one of the consequences of that is the idea that things have changed so much around us that we're really not adapted to the environment that we're in anymore. And I don't really believe that, because I think that the idea that the primary forces that shaped our evolution shaped them during that period of time, call it roughly a 7 million year period of time, something like that. And that was somehow a special time for human evolution that set our nature. I don't believe that. I mean, it's true to some degree, but it's more useful to view the evolution of human cognitive processes over the entire span of evolutionary history and not necessarily give preference to any particular epoch. And I certainly believe that the idea that we're no longer adapted to the environment because of our rapid technological transformations is simply not true. And the reason I think that it's not true is because the fundamental constants of the environment, let's say, or it's more the fundamental constituent elements of being, I think that's the right way to think about it, they're the same. They haven't changed a bit, and there's no way of changing them, as far as I can tell, without us being radically and incomprehensibly different than we are. And you know, with the rapid rise of artificial intelligence and robotics and all of that, it's certainly possible that in 500 years we'll be so unlike the way we are now that we won't even be the same creatures. I don't think that's a particularly great outcome, but it's certainly possible. So what are the fundamental constituent elements? Well, they're expressed in mythology, but they're not merely symbolic. I think it's the wrong way to think about it. They're symbolic, but they reflect a very deep reality, and they actually reflect a reality that's not easily apprehensible directly by the senses. Now, your senses are tuned for a particular duration. That's roughly, excuse me, that's roughly the duration that you live, let's say, but more importantly, it's the duration, whatever that duration is, across which meaningful actions take place. And we kind of have some idea of what that duration is. You know, if you look at a computer screen, if it has a refresh rate of less than 60 hertz, you can see it flickering, but above 60 hertz you can't. It's uniform. And with movies, anywhere between 20 and 50 frames a second is enough to give you the illusion of continual motion. So, you know, we live in a universe that's above the 10th of a second domain, or maybe the 100th of a second, somewhere in there anyways. And I mean, it's not like time isn't almost infinitely subdivisable at higher levels of resolution than that. But we don't operate, generally speaking, at higher temporal resolution than that. And then, you know, our feeling of the felt moment seems to be, I would say, something approximating half a second to a second. You know, I mean, it's an estimate, obviously, but a second is a meaningful unit of time for a person, and 100th of a second really isn't, and certainly a billionth of a second isn't. And then, you know, we can think across hours and days and weeks and months, but we really can't. Once you start getting out into years, it gets kind of sketchy, and it's hard to think more than 5 years down the road. And the reason for that is that the particulars upon which you're basing your predictions are likely to change sufficiently over a 5-year period, so that extending out your vision past that just exposes you to accelerating error, right? And of course that's the problem with predicting the future period. So we live in a time range that's about, say, 1/10 of a second to three years, something like that. Now I know it can expand beyond that, but that's kind of where we're set. And our senses seem to be tuned to those durations and to be operative so that we make proper decisions within those durations. And also from a particular spatial position and so forth, you know. Your eyes see what's roughly, maybe we could say, a walkable distance in front of you, something like that. So, and you detect things in the locale that enables you to immediately interact with things. But it isn't necessarily the case that senses that are tuned to do that are also tuned to inform you directly about what the most permanent things about being itself are. I think that those things have to be inferred, and there's some supporting evidence for that kind of thing from psycholinguistics. There's a level of categorization that we seem to manifest more or less automatically or implicitly. So, for example, when children perceive animals, they perceive at the level of cat or dog. They don't perceive at the level of subspecies like Siamese cat or let's say Samoyed. You know, there's a natural, I can't remember what they call that, base category, something like that. It's usually specified by very short words that are easily learnable, and so the linguistic system seems to map right onto the object recognition characteristics of the sensory systems that are built right into it. And if they weren't built into it, we couldn't communicate easily, because our natural categories, I think that's it, but it's probably wrong. Our natural categories, they have to be the same for everyone, or it would be very difficult for us to communicate. Okay, so having said all that, then the question is, well, what are the most real categories? And I think there's a real division in ways to think about this, because there's a scientific way of thinking about it, and in that case the most real categories are, well, mathematical equations certainly seem to be in the top category there, the equations that describe the physical universe. But then the hypothesis of the existence of such things as protons and electrons, and, you know, the material elements that make up everything, that's every element of being, with the possible exception of empty space. But in the mythological world, the categories, I think, are more derived from Darwinian, by the effect of Darwinian processes on cognitive and perceptual function. So, which is to say that we have learned to perceive and then to infer those things that are most necessary for us in order to continue our existence, propagate, live well, all of those things. And that would be true at the level of individual survival, and maybe it's also true at the level of group survival, although, you know, there's a tremendous debate among evolutionary biologists about whether or not selection can take place at the level of the group. Anyways, there are these basic level categories that manifest themselves to you, and then there's categories of the imagination that you have to infer up from the sensory domain. And we do that partly in science by comparing our sensory representations across people, but we also do it by thinking abstractly, conceptualizing abstractly. And, you know, one of the things that's interesting about abstractions is it's not clear whether they're more or less real than the things they're abstracted from. This is a perennial debate among, let's call them ontologists, who are interested in the fundamental nature of reality itself, in some sense independent of conceptual structures. Are numbers more or less real than the things they represent? It's a really hard question to answer, because using numbers as a representational system gives you unbelievable power. And there are mathematicians that believe that there isn't anything more real than mathematical representations. Now, it depends to some degree, of course, on how you classify reality. That's the problem with the question, like, is A equivalent to B? The answer to that always is, well, it depends on how you define A, and it depends on how you define B. So generally it's not a very useful question, but you can still get the point that there's something very real about abstractions, incredibly real, because otherwise why would you bother with them? They wouldn't give you any handle on the world. So what's the most useful, or what's the broadest possible level of abstraction, and is there any utility in thinking in that manner? And I tried to make the case last time that in the mythological world there are 3 categories, or 4 depending on what you do with the strange 4th category, because the 4th category is sort of the category of uncategorizable entities. And so it's sort of the category of everything that not only do you not know, but you don't know it. Or you could think about it as the category of potential. I actually think that's the best way to think about it, is that it's the dragon of chaos is the category of potential. And I do believe that where our materialist view is essentially wrong. I think that the proper way of looking at being is that being is potential, and from that potential, whatever consciousness is extracts out the reality that we inhabit. Anyways, that's certainly the mythological viewpoint, but it's not just a mythological viewpoint. It's a sequence of ideas, for example, that deeply underlies the thinking of Jean Piaget. And Piaget, by the way, was very interested in reconciling the gap between religion and science. That's really what he devoted his life to doing. And there are other streams of philosophy, and I would say Heidegger, the phenomenologists, are thinking along lines that are similar to this as well, because Heidegger was concerned not with the nature of material reality, but with being as such. And so you can extract out the viewpoint that I just described from mythology, but it isn't the only source of such, what would you call it, hypotheses is probably the right idea. So the idea, you can think about this as a bootstrapping process in some sense. Is in order for anything to get going, it has to bootstrap itself up and become more and more complex as it does that. So it's like, this is the answer to the chicken and egg problem, right? Which was first, the chicken or the egg? Well, neither. Something from which both the chicken and egg were derived, right? Because the ultimate answer to that is the answer to how there are things at all. Who knows? But at some point there were neither chickens nor eggs, but there were the things that were the precursors to those things. And so they spiraled upwards in some sense, and those initial proto-entities, single-celled animals you can go back farther than that, but we could say, well, single-cell animals differentiated over time, right? And there's this looping process that differentiates out into both the chicken and the egg. So, but what the question is, what do you need in order for that process to begin? And that's really the question of what the fundamental constituent elements of reality are. And the mythological hypothesis is that there's 3 or 4. One is the fact that there has to be something that manifests itself as an observer. It's something like that. Some kind of observer. Now, where that process of observation starts in the phylogenetic chain is very, very difficult to tell. We might say, well, there's certainly no possibility of a conscious observer until there's a differentiated nervous system. But then prior to the emergence of differentiated nervous systems, there were animals that were complex enough to react with the environment in a manner that, well, single-celled animals, they're quite complex. I mean, some of them are unbelievably complicated. They can move themselves through space, they can orient, they can follow chemical trails. They're not stupid by any stretch of the imagination. Now, to what degree they have being, as something they can represent, well, we don't have to speculate on that, but the proto-elements of conscious being are there. So you need a being, you need the structure of that being through which the entirety of being itself is interpreted, and you need the surround. It's something like that. And so I conceptualize that as something that knows, that's the knower, what it knows, that's the interpretive structure, and that which needs to be known.